I love photography and I would much rather be out taking pictures, creating images rather than editing images in Lightroom or Photoshop. But editing raw images is a necessary evil. So the easiest way to do them is get in and out as quickly as possible. Editing raw images is kind of daunting to some photographers, and in this tutorial I'm going to attempt to remove some of the mystery of editing raw images. Here's an image I photographed with my lens baby, and out of the camera it looks really flat. So you look at this image and say, how do I bring it to fruition? Okay, I'm in the basic panel in Lightroom's Develop module, and I've got several different settings I can work with to bring this image to life. First off, let's examine what these particular sliders affect in the histogram. Here's my histogram, and if I go over the left part of the histogram, notice that it says blacks, and blacks are highlighted in the tone area. If I move to the right, the shadow slider affects this area of the histogram. If I move right one more time, this area of the histogram is affected by the exposure slider. I move right one more time, and the highlights slider affects this area of the histogram, and one more to the right, and the whites slider affects this area of the histogram. In the past, previous versions of Lightroom, the exposure slider took care of your exposure all the way across the board. Now you start with, you've got to get your white clipping point and your black clipping point. I've got a pretty decent histogram here, but I need to drag my white clipping point a little bit to the right. But how far? And how far before I blow it out? Now I've got a couple of things here that I can click. I've got this control that shows highlight clipping and this control that shows shadow clipping. There's also a keyboard shortcut to toggle these on and off. If you press J, it will turn both of these controls on and off. Now I'm going to start with my blacks in the shadow area. And to bring the blacks to life, I'm going to drag this slider to the left. Now to see when I'm going to start clipping, I can use this control, which will show overlays in the image, or I can press the Option key or the Alt key on a Windows machine, and as I click this slider, a white overlay appears. Now I drag to the left until I start seeing, and I've got to go pretty far there. I've got some color up on the top there. If I drag to the right until that disappears, now my blacks are set. Now that's automatically brought some life to the image. Now let's go to the whites, the other end of the histogram. If I press down my Option key on a Mac or my Alt key on a Windows machine and drag this to the right, and right about there, I'm starting to see some areas blow out. And that's how it looks like with your highlight clipping warning control. So I'm just going to press down Option again, Alt on a Windows machine, and just drag this to the left until they disappear. Now my white point is set, but it's still rather drab. Now this is actually a lot brighter than I remembered it, so I'm going to drag my exposure slider to the left. Now brightness is about right there. It's lacking a little bit in contrast, and I'm also going to do one other thing here. To make my whites pop a little bit more, I'm actually going to drag my highlight slider to the left. It's kind of a yin-yang thing between the whites and the highlights. I can drag my shadow slider to the right to bring some light into the shadow area. In this case, I don't want to. A little shortcut for you: to return this to its default parameter, all I need to do is double click the slider and it returns it to its default parameter. I can reset the entire tone by double clicking tone. In this case, I don't want to, so I'm going to go back to my history panel and click my last setting. Now that's where I'm at so far with the image. It needs a little bit more pop as far as I'm concerned, so I'm going to drag the contrast slider to the right. And contrast is really a personal setting. All of these are really personal. You're the photographer, you're the artist, so you remember what the image looks like and then use these sliders to get it where you want it to be. These are just some guidelines for getting the image where it should be in the first place. Another thing to look at, if your camera goofed on the white balance, which can happen in tricky lighting situations, you can click this little white balance tool and just click an area that is supposed to be white. Now that's closer to what I remember, but actually I'm going to go up here and try auto and see what Lightroom gives me. Well, that's way off. So I'm going to go back to as shot. And again, you can play around with the white balance if you want to warm it up a little bit. Drag your temperature slider to the right. In this case, it's a little bit too warm, so I'm going to drag it back to the left a little bit. And there's one more thing that I do on just about every image that I create to get a little pop into it. It's something called clarity, vibrance, and saturation. I drag the clarity slider up to a setting of 42. Vibrance to 15, and saturation to 15. Okay, now that's looking a lot better than the original photo. Here's the original photo that I imported, and that's what it looks like now. It's got a lot more pop to it, a lot more punch, and there's a lot more I can do to the image, but this is a good starting point. Here I've got one more image that's shot under the same lighting conditions. So what can I do to speed up my workflow? If I select the two of these images and then click sync, now what do I want to synchronize? First off, I'm going to start by clicking check none. And then I'm going to choose process version. Now what did I do in this image? I adjusted the white balance, the basic tone, and I added vibrance, saturation, and clarity to the image. So now if I click synchronize, all of these settings are applied to the next image, and it's just cut my work time down by a ton. The only thing I've got to do here, I've got a little bit of clipping in the blacks, so if I just drag this slider to the right until that disappears, there, that's just about perfect. There's the before on that image, there's the after. Now notice my workflow on the second image was cut way down because I just copied the settings. And that's a beginning primer on processing raw images in the Develop module.